Welcome to Rick Rack Ruby. I'm Laura Cluvo. I've been having a lot of fun sewing with custom knit fabrics. There's so many options, I'm kind of overwhelmed. Sometimes I can't even sleep at night thinking of all the fun things that I want to make. And one of my most successful patterns has been the Altitude Pullover by Peekaboo Patterns. This is an indie pattern company and I just absolutely love them, and this particular pattern I've made at least 6 times. And so this is the pattern that I wanted to feature today. We will be making the Altitude Pullover from Peekaboo Patterns in this adorable elf themed fabric. The front is a panel and there are pockets, side pockets, and it's just bright and cheerful and colorful, and of course, fun and easy. So let's get started. Let's start with the pattern. This is the Altitude Pullover from Peekaboo Pattern Shop. This is a digital file. You just download it. I downloaded it right onto my phone, and then I attach it to an email and I send it to my local FedEx Kinko, and I asked them to print it in color because every size is a different color. So I wanted to make sure I could make that distinction. Then I used this, it's called Swedish Tracing Paper. This is available from, I don't know how you say it, WAWAK, 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 I'm not sure. But anyway, this Swedish tracing paper is it's designed so that you can trace your pattern, then actually sew your pattern from this paper so you can try it on, you know, for fitting or whatever. But I love this stuff. And since most of these are half patterns, I can just fold this in half and I can still see through it, and then I'll trace and cut out the patterns. I like to have the pattern, the full pattern, just in case I want to do some color blocking or something. It makes it easier. There are also some dimensions here for the sleeve cuff, the bottom band, neck band, and knit trim. I like to use this for the rectangles. It's from Post-it, and it's just a 1-inch grid, but it makes it easy to cut out, you know, 5 by 7 or whatever. You can just cut on the grid with your paper scissors, of course. But the first couple inches of this are sticky, like a Post-it note, and so that's great for the little strips. So for instance, for my 1-inch strip, it's nice to have it sticky, so it's easier to adhere and easier to cut. So I have already cut out all of my pieces for this project, and I am ready to sew. Okay, the first step is to apply these binding strips to the sides of the pocket. This is the pocket. And this is the only step, I think, where I varied from the instructions. I cut my strip, instead of 1 inch, I cut it 1.25 inches. And I'm going to sew it right sides together along this curved edge. I'm going to pin and stitch with my trusty regular sewing machine, the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to wrap this around and top stitch it so that it makes a neat finish on the back, and then I'll be back. This is the same technique that I used on the leggings, and it was so successful, it turned out so beautifully, that I just used the same technique for this, and it always turns out perfectly. The first edge is pinned, and now I'm going to stitch with my machine a regular straight stitch, but I kind of tug a little bit as I go to make sure that these seams are flat. I'll be right back. Here we go, this is sewn. And now I'm going to fold this around to the back. It's already folded under 1/4 inch. So I'll wrap that around, and I'm going to pin it from the back first to make sure that that seam is covered. although it's not super important. And then I'm going to top stitch it from the front and carefully remove the pins as I go. I've pinned that along the back and I'm going to sew from the top, but I'm going to reach under and pull out these pins as I go. I'm going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch in from this seam. This turned out beautifully. Here's the front and the back. One tip for you is to set your machine so that it always stops with the needle down. So that way when I would pause to remove those pins, the needle was down and holding everything tight. So now I'm just going to do the same thing for the opposite side. Now I'm placing the pocket on top of the pullover front. I'm going to try to get these sides symmetric, and I will baste along the top edge, the scoop, and the bottom here, down, across, and up. All right, the basting is done, and now we're going to create the pocket. On the pattern, there's an indication, there's a little line right there, and that is where the pocket begins. So in other words, starting right here, this part will be open, and the same thing on the other side. So what I'm going to do now is stitch 1/8 of an inch in from this outside edge, and I'm going to stop right here and backstitch. Stitch along here, stop right here and backstitch, leaving this part open. This is done, the pockets are complete, and the next step is done on the serger. These are the sleeves, and I'm going to join the sleeve to the front, and then here's the back. Let's see, here it is, and then the other sleeve. So we'll join all these parts together, and I'll be right back. Now we have something that's starting to look like a shirt, but next we're going to sew up these seams. So I will match this underarm seam right here, pin, and stitch the seam from the wrist all the way to the hem on both sides. I'm going to use my serger for this. This looks good. From here on out, I'm going to follow the instructions exactly as they are for this altitude pullover. And next will be the cuffs. So I'll fold these together side to side. I'm going to serge up that seam, and then I'm going to fold this up. These are done, and now I'm going to fold this back. And at this point, it's important to recognize that there is a side that will be, when your cuff is like this, see, this elf will be upside down, right? So we don't want that. We want him to be right side up, which would be this way. So have a look at your fabric and be sure that when you put your cuff in, that you're putting the right sides together, which means that this, I'm going to consider this to be my right side, because this side is in alignment with the direction of the sleeve, and I'm going to put this right sides together with this sleeve. I also like to sew from the inside of the sleeve. So this, I'm going to match up the seam like this, and then I'll pin and kind of stretch to fit, and then I'll serge around this edge. And here's how my sleeve looks after I've serged it. Remember, right sides together from the inside of the sleeve. And then when I turn it right side out, the cuff looks good and the characters are in the right direction. And of course, if your fabric is non-directional, you won't have to worry about that. Now I'll repeat for the second cuff. The cuffs are done, and now I'm going to do the bottom band. I'm using this fabric that was left over from the bottom of this panel, and so instead of cutting one long strip, I have two shorter strips. I just divided the dimensions in half and added an inch for seam allowances. So the first thing that I'll do is serge these two short sides, and then I will come back. Here's my bottom band. I will fold this with the wrong sides together, and I'm going to pin it, and I'm actually going to press this bottom edge. Here's a serger tip. Instead of laying the serger seam flat on one side and sort of doubling it up like this, if you press one seam, the end of the seam to one side and the other seam to the other side, and fold it up so that they nest, I think that's the word, you won't have as thick of a bump right there, so your serger doesn't get hung up. Voice of experience. I've divided this into quarters and marked the quarters with pins. Here's the seams and then the centers. And likewise, I have the seams and the centers here. I'll turn this right side out, inside out, and match up the seams and the centers and pin it in preparation for serging. Okay, I've pinned this all around, and now I will serge it. There is my lovely serged bottom band. Let me turn this right side out and we'll have a look at it. This looks awesome. Okay, the next step is the cowl or the collar. There are two pieces that are shaped like this. The important thing when you are cutting it out is that the top edge is this smooth edge with no notches. So be sure that your print is oriented correctly. I'm going to put the right sides together and stitch this top edge, this rounded edge. Then I'm going to turn it to the right side. I'm going to sew this on my sewing machine, my regular sewing machine, and I'm going to switch to white thread. I have stitched along this curved edge, turned it to the right side, pressed it, and pinned it in preparation for top stitching. The top stitching is 3/4 of an inch from the edge. And here is a pro tip from Ruby. When I'm turning, I want to roll this seam all the way to the stitches. And I just dip my fingers in a cup of water and I kind of roll it that way, and it really helps. So now I'm going to top stitch 3/4 of an inch from the edge. The top stitching is beautiful. I used a lot of pins, and that really helps to prevent the layers from slipping. Now I'm going to baste together these raw edges. There are notches in the front edge of the cowl, and the next thing we're going to do is fold this over, matching these front notches. There's also a notch in the back center right here. When I overlap these notches, this becomes the center front. So I'm going to pin this here. And I'm going to based from here all the way to here. So just the parts that overlap from point to point, from there to there. Now I'm placing the cowl over the pullover. I'm matching up this back notch, the back center, as well as the front center. Now, the first time I made this, I was pretty skeptical because this is 4 layers of fabric in the cowl and 2 layers of fabric in the front of the pullover, and I was just thinking that's a lot of layers of fabric to sew through. But the Peekaboo pattern has provided us with a successful hack. Okay, so we're going to base this a 1/2 inch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then trim to 1/4 inch, and then we're going to serge to finish it. And it really works. It's amazing. I've basted this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm turning it just to make sure that everything looks good, nice and smooth, no little edges got caught or anything. And now with my super sharp Kai scissors, which I love, I'm going to trim this seam allowance to 1/4 inch. And now I'm just going to serge this edge. And there we go. The serger didn't have to cut very much. I only had a few little shreds that the cutter actually cut. And the serger mostly was just finishing that seam, which is a great technique. I'm going to remember that one. So let's have a look. Looks pretty good. There's my pockets, my cowl. I'm going to say that it's done. Thank you for watching my tutorial. If you're enjoying my videos, please like, share, and subscribe.